Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Scholastic Lutheran stream. Jared and I are going to discuss pretty much just our favorite books of 2022. This is very much on the fly. We're, not scripted here at all, just kind of going for it. We have some books picked out that we really liked. We're going to be talking in general about some things we read this year. So you might hear some about what you shouldn't read or things that are maybe nice but not in our top five. So I figured I would go ahead and get started with myself first. I read quite a few things this year. I read various things from Second Temple literature that were interesting. The Book of Jubilees, some of the smaller various narratives like the Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah. I read the entirety of Plato and the relevant Socratic works of Xenophon and Aristophanes' The Clouds. So got some classic philosophy in. None of those are making the top five list for this stream, but I read a bunch of that stuff. It was all fairly interesting, occasionally mind-numbing, other times good. Read some other books that probably aren't worth reading. If you're ever thinking that you should read some of the mid to late 20th century Lutheran Orthodox dialogues, you should give it a second thought and not do it because it wasn't worth it. And various other books, some better than others, but no need to discuss them all. Jared, what'd you read this year?
Yeah, so this year I believe I finished all of Clement of Alexandria. I mean, he's not that long. Like all the stuff public domain, of course. Same with St. Ambrose, finished all of his public domain stuff. So that took me several months. It was like 1,300 pages or something like that. And I try to take time with him so I can understand his system. Um, Other than that, I saw a lot of philosophy books, some stuff from specifically Alan Wolter, Wolfgang Smith, and then also some, just Lutheran scholastics. So solid amount of Gerhard. Actually, I really got through some Quenstedt, Hutter. Like, was it Hutter? It was a Honeyus, I think, not Hutter. Um, and I honestly, there's some stuff. Honeyus is kind of hit or miss, honestly, because for example, I was really excited to read his Dia Skepsis Theologica. I was like, okay, this is gonna be good. It's directly gonna be responding to the Reformed, but the entire thing was just like, hey, this is what the Reformed say we say. That's literally it. It's like really long, just quotes. And it's like, well, it's phenomenal for what it's looking to do. No reason to read it though, to be honest with you. So, what would you say was one of the best books you read?
Yeah, this is no particular order, but I have five picked
Yeah.
out. First one, I have four books that are four books that are I have on hard copy and one I read, not on hard copy, read it on digital PDF. But first one is Disillusioned by Joshua Schuping. It's a smaller book. It is, let me tell you how many pages it is. The entire page count is 141 pages. I give this one like a 4 out of 5 stars. The content of the book is very good. The general premise is that Joshua Schuping was an Orthodox priest. He went to St. Vladimir Seminary, and then he converted to become Reformed. He's actually part of some more Wesleyan holiness church body, to my understanding, at least last I checked. But he's seemingly Reformed in theology. He cites like the Westminster Confession in here, and frequently references Chemnitz and Pieper, actually, for Lutheran theologians, as well as people like Churiton in the Reformed tradition. So he's broadly Protestant in the book. The book is pretty much on, why he left the Eastern Orthodox priesthood. He's very, very clearly familiar with the standard online parlance and debates, like the standard issues that you would expect, which is a lot more than I can say for a lot of people, at least like online writing on these topics. A lot of Protestant versus Orthodox dialogues and debates online are really, really horrible and pretty bad. But Schuping clearly has a grasp and understanding of the like standards of Orthodox theology and the standards of Protestant theologies, rather than just grabbing some random statement from Luther and assuming that all Protestants believe some random statement that Luther made in a table talk, or grabbing some random Eastern Orthodox saint and saying that everyone's bound in the Orthodox Church to some random saint. He actually understands what's binding on both sides and goes through some of the issues. He provides some pretty bad extreme examples of, at least from a Protestant perspective, some pretty bad extreme examples of Eastern Orthodox practices that are, well, we would say unorthodox. So overall, good book. Print quality, very low, and colloquial style, and sometimes citations aren't that great. They're always citations, but they're not always super specific, and they're not like an academic citation. So that's why I'd give it a 4 out of 5. Points off mostly for formal things, not necessarily for content. Jared, what you got? First book.
Yeah, so all of the books that I'm going to be talking about I would give them 5 stars. I mean, there's one book I have that, yeah, low print quality, but like it is so good that I won't override it. But the first book I have is going to be Alan Wolter's Transcendental, or The Transcendentals and Their Function in the Metaphysics of John Duns Scotus. As I've mentioned before, pretty much anything by Alan Wolter is recommended because he really well introduces Scotian thought. And he covers, I think, what are the most interesting questions. So he covers univocity, for example, and explains how, well, this isn't just arbitrary, and this isn't, as a lot of online people say, just trying to make God more like a creature. I really hate when people say that. And even though I'm agnostic with the analogy univocity debate, I still think it's a caricature to say that Scotus and others were just trying to deny analogy to make God more like us. No, he spends time saying, well, on an ontological, it was either an ontological or epistemological basis, but regardless, there needs to be a middle term when you're talking about God, and so being should be univocal such that we can understand what's actually going on. When you're making, say, syllogisms, you need a middle term that connects this stuff. And if being is not univocal, then it doesn't work. That's at least Scotus's argument. And so he is really, really looking to preserve our language. And he spends a lot of time, or Wolter does, explaining how, well, that's not to say, oh yeah, God is just different than us in degree. He says that Scotus secures this by the use of infinity. And that's really important because, well, with Aquinas, you're primarily going to be looking at God as that which has its essence identical to existence, whereas Scotus is primarily infinite being. What's really helpful about that is, well, a lot of people just throw around the term infinity. I've mentioned this before in one of my earliest videos about the dangers of pop apologetics. A lot of people just throw around the term infinity to say, oh, well, God can just do anything because he's infinite, and they don't have a reason why. They don't explain what infinity actually entails. But Scotus spends a lot of time determining what infinity allows. And so I recommend that book immensely, even if you disagree with it. I'm agnostic on a lot of it, but it was phenomenal to get that understanding. And it's also very helpful just for terms for the transcendentals. I think Scotus has some good stuff on disjunctive transcendentals. So that's my first book I'd recommend. What about you? Any other stuff?
Yeah, second on the stack. Once again, this is our short one, not too big. God at Work by Jean Edward Veith, which is like a standard, honestly, in Lutheran circles. And it is, let me tell you the page number once again. This is 164 pages. And God at Work is pretty much a shorter version of a 19th century work in which Luther is summarized. So this is a kind of a summary of a summary. So there's a work called Luther on Vocation by Gustav Wingren. And Jean Edward Veith acknowledges that he's pretty much just summarizing that book and condensing it into a modern context. But I read through this with my wife, and we both really liked it. If you're looking for like a very short and lay level treatment of vocation, this is kind of the go-to book. The overall thrust is pretty much that God calls you to certain offices in your life, and those offices are in traditionally the 3 estates of the church and these state, if you will, and your home life. Vingren kind of goes with the four estates model, which includes like workplace as the fourth estate, or kind of like the economy of some sort, which is traditionally part of like family and older thought. But some people have embraced kind of the four estate model in more modern Lutheranism. I believe that comes from Bonhoeffer. But overall, great book if you want to understand how to view things like your work, especially if you are in the American context where there's a lot of kind of evangelical stuff floating around about, trying to find God's purpose for your life, or if God wants you to be like an engineer or something like that. He navigates a lot of those issues on a very practical level. So this book has a lot of just daily practical stuff you can follow, and is very easy, quick read. You're not going to be dealing with a lot of dry content. He's engaging. So highly recommend it. If you want more, obviously go read Vingren instead. But at a LA level, this one's a great choice.
Sounds really interesting, actually. I mean, that makes me think of how some of my favorite works are going to be more lay level. I think the people that can take a really interesting concept and put it down to lay level, but keep it really interesting, even for people who know like theology really extensively. I think that is a gift. That's why one of my favorite books ever, which I'm not including this as one of the books here, but Wolfmueller's Has American Christianity Failed? Even though there's some slight things that aren't best with it, like, evangelicalism is a hard movement to define. It's still phenomenal because it's like, I know all of this stuff already. Like, I already get this stuff from the confessions, a lot of it at least. But it's like he presents it in such a good way that I can just constantly reread this. Even my girlfriend, who she's not from an evangelical world, she really likes the stuff that we've read together. So yeah, I agree. That book sounds really good. I haven't read it though, so I'll have to pick that one up. That sounds great. Anyway, so for my next one, again, I'm largely reading like philosophy stuff and all that. My next one is probably going to be Peter Coffey's Ontology, or the Theory of Being. It's really, really good because it's very just dense, clear to the point in my mind. I mean, there's some parts that are going to be more confusing, but it is a thorough treatment of ontology, at least from a Thomist framework, and much of which I think just scholastics in general could affirm. I know there are some differences, of course, in the metaphysics and the physics of Scotus, and I would assume so for Occam and Suarez and various other scholastics like Bonaventure. But it's still really good to understand at least the Thomist framework, and it's one of those things I would practically consider a textbook to read. I thought he had a really interesting critique of Scotus. I don't think it necessarily works. He basically argues that Scotus is a kind of Platonist with the reality of the formalities. I don't think that fully works, but or at worst, I'd just be like, okay, you know what I mean? Like that's like, bite the bullet. You're not really risking much there. But it's still really good, and it's an interesting treatment and response of Scotus, because I think he understands Scotus. He's not wrong on it, but I thought it was really good in that respect, and I'd highly recommend that because it's just a great work to like just dig into, and I'm definitely going to be referencing it in the future whenever I make videos, or just whenever I do my own personal study and I'm trying to understand or use concepts that Thomists would use. So
nice. My third book is a thick one. I've not finished this, but I've been reading it this year. Is Gerhard's On the Nature of Theology and on Scripture. So this is the CPH volume. It's really two of Gerhard's loci. So the CPH volumes are often they're mixes of Gerhard. So you have multiple loci inside of a single volume. So the first locus is On the Nature of Theology, which is a very brief prolegomena, and that is not very long at all. It's maybe the first not even quarter of the book. Maybe like the first sixth or eighth of the book is that, and then the rest of it's on Scripture. I'm kind of cheating. I've read some of this book before, actually a good chunk of it. I use mostly Gerhard's material as reference stuff. I'm not usually just reading straight through it. I read chunks of it as I need. But we're going through this one at church for a study, And so this is in my opinion, of the stuff I've read of Gerhard, this is my favorite work. I think his stuff on like prolegomena and scripture in general as foundations is really, really good. He covers, all the standard viewpoints from the fathers through the medievals up to his time on virtually all the matters of theology in question in all of his loci. So if you're looking for the most extensive Lutheran treatment on any topic, Gerhard's kind of your go-to. Later theologians develop things more. Gerhard is the lengthiest of them. So Gerhard's loci, all 38 volumes, at least if you include the exegesis volumes, is longer than, say, Quenstedt or Kalev or Hollatz, even if those later authors did develop things farther. So if you're looking for just the kind of the longest expression and analyzing the most opposing viewpoints and things like that, Gerhard's kind of your go-to. My favorite part of this volume in particular is his handling on questions of the sufficiency of Scripture. It's specifically its self-sufficiency, saying that it's independent as an authority from things like the church. So he's defending sola scriptura. So in general, a great volume there. I have some criticisms of it, but I don't need to get into all of those. I don't think all of his takes are perfectly accurate, especially in some of the stuff about Hebrew vowel points and whatnot. But in general, the Hebrew vowel points, that argument, well, pretty much modern archaeology tore it to pieces. But I can see why he made it in the time, at least. I still don't buy it at all. But nonetheless, overall, it is among the best of Lutheran works. I know it's expensive from CPH, but maybe you can if you get your pastor to buy it and in bulk. I think it's 10 volumes or more counts as bulk at CPH, and you get like a 10% discount on it. So I got it for like $7 off, which I don't know. I mean, $7. It's 63 versus $70. How much really is that? But it's something. So I'll take it.
Yeah, I read that one in late 2020, I think. Was really good. I really enjoyed that too. I'll warn people it's a little dry, as all Gerhard is. Gerhard is dry. Well, at least it's like more dogmatic stuff.
Yeah, his dogmatic text it's pretty dry. I mean, it could be even drier, but it's pretty darn dry.
Yeah. It could be drier, but
it could be drier.
It's still really good. Like it's worth it. It's not like dry and I'm getting nothing out of it. It's like I'm dry, but it's so valuable to read. So I recommend that. And I consistently reference it. When I was making the Sola Scriptura video, I referenced that one, I think. I think I used some statements from him or some arguments I could have sworn, but pair that with Chemnitz's examination of the Council of Trent, Volume 1, and William Whitaker's disputation on Holy Scripture, and you have a pretty darn good understanding of Sola Scriptura. The final book I mentioned there, Disputation on Holy Scripture, that book is free on I think you just Google it. It's free. You can read it through Google Books, and that was really good. I would say I don't know if it's quite as good as Gerhard's, but it's still really good. It's written by an Anglican guy. It's good. Seth, while we're here, there's like one question a guy has.
Oh, yeah, I see a couple in the chat.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to see.
There's one that says, do
we know of any good
Lutheran books on? Oh, go ahead.
That just defend our theological stances. I mean, I have a ton. I had a video from a while back on them. So yeah, the one that you just showed would be one of them. Chemnitz's examination of the Council of Trent. Yeah, pretty much anything from Martin Chemnitz. The Book of Concord. I mean, it really just depends on what you're looking for, because there are a lot. And so if you're looking for like something on sacraments, I'd give you something else probably, but you just have to specify in the chat if you're still here, and we can answer that. But yeah, pretty much anything Chemnitz, Gerhard, read that.
Yeah, as a broad like overview of a Lutheran defense of our positions, I mean, like the Gerhard Loci is going to be like the gold standard. Obviously, that's like, I mean, that's just an enormous purchase to make, though. It's huge, and they're still publishing them. And the whole set won't be published, but the bulk of the volumes will be. That's like your go-to if you're looking for a really thorough and kind of addressing all the big arguments. And then Chemnitz Examen being the one against Rome in particular. Chemnitz's apology for the Book of Concord, which is not an apology for the entire Book of Concord necessarily, but is more so a defense of the formula of Concord against Reformed theology and the crypto Calvinists and the pseudo Lutherans. So like all of those groups is what Chemnitz is kind of defending against. So those are kind of your like standards. I know those are expensive volumes though too.
He just specified in the chat, he said vocation theology, and then he said specifically a Pentecostal questioned our view of the role of the pastor and him being the only one who can give the sacraments. I mean, just my immediate thought. I feel like there's going to be just anything on the office of the ministry would be one. But I feel like, you just kind of think of church order, right? Like think of Paul where he talks about good church order, and he talks about pastors being the stewards of the mysteries in 1 Corinthians 4. And just thinking about how, like, well, they're the ones who are handling this stuff. And so we give them that role. We don't say that nobody can perform a baptism. We have there are such things as emergency baptisms, which a layman can give, but in good church order, you do that. That's their job. So that's just my immediate thought. And there's just any book on the office of the ministry, probably.
Yeah, I can't think of any like that are specifically handling that topic off the top of my head. So the vocation theology is on like more of like all daily or not daily offices. That's a confusion of terms. All offices you just hold in your daily life. So I mean, the vocation theology book is much more on like, what do I do as a father or a brother, or what do I do as a student, or an engineer, as Jared and I both are. I guess you're a data scientist. That's pretty much engineering.
Yeah. I'm at this point, I'm like my job, I straight up do like my position as a data analyst, but I'm like a dashboard developer at this point, which actually is pretty tough. Like there's a lot of coding on the back end with Power BI, but that's a whole other thing. But go on.
Yeah. The vocation theology is more on like anything that could be a role in your life. Those are all offices or vocations, and so you're handling those. As far as this office of the ministry question, that probably wouldn't be answered in. I mean, it is like addressed by vocation, like the theology vocation to some degree, but I'd look more at stuff that's specifically on the ministry. So there's the Gerhard volume on the ministry. Chemnitz does talk about it in his Loci. I assume at least he touches on it.
I would think so. I feel like he talks about it.
I haven't read all of it.
Neither I've read most of it. It's really good, of course.
He does talk about the Enchiridion. Yeah, he does. I don't agree with all his takes on the Enchiridion on it, but he does talk about it. That's not too deep. It answers like some basic questions. Honestly, though, my recommendation would be like reading through like any of these systematics texts. There's a bunch of them in public domain, like Widener or Stump.
Yeah,
or
that's a good one.
Lindbergh, any of those, like read through them and just look at like the scripture passages and the arguments they're making. That will like pretty much defend their position. As far as defending it against opposing views, that's where it gets a little more difficult, and where I just have to say like, yeah, get Gerhard, because he's going to address arguments against opposing views.
Yeah. One thing I should quickly say is there's one guy in the chat here, Zigmas. I keep forgetting. I need to recommend on the channel. He and his friend put out a video on Kierkegaard, which I thought was really interesting. So I'm not a Kierkegaard expert, but he had a video that was really interesting on some problems with Kierkegaard as to how a lot of Lutherans overestimate him, because Kierkegaard has like a bad definition of faith and all that stuff. And it's like, if you read too much Kierkegaard, then you're kind of, and you like take a lot of his stuff and you're like, yeah, I like this. Then it's like, well, he definitely has some non-Lutheran ideas or ideas that would be really bad for a Lutheran to affirm. It like takes away the concept of certainty. Like takes away, like he's big on doubt. Point is, hi Sigmas.
He's a Enlightenment thinker.
Yeah.
So
yeah. But anyway, we got off topic, but for good reason. Good reason. My next one, this is the only physical one that I have with me today. All the others that I mentioned are pretty much all the others, or at least 3 of them, are going to be on archive.org, so they're free. This one here is not, but it's worth it. This one was like $35. What is Physics? Defense of Classical Theism. It's by a guy named Nigel Cundy. This thing is, look at this. It's a brick. This is the book I was referencing before. The print is not perfect. I mean, the back of it, like it's clearly not actually typed in. It's like an image of the text, so it's like pretty blurry there on the front too. The actual text in here is good. This book is 742 pages. I got it for $35 on Amazon. Look how big the text is. Look how small this is. This is perfect. Look at this. 742 pages of that. Well, it's so good because so he's a classical theist, he's specifically a Thomist. Listen to these. This is the chapters. Chapter one's introduction. Chapter two is tools. He's talking like logic, probability, scientific model, then metaphysics. This is chapter three. Chapter four is Aristotelian metaphysics. Chapter five, Aristotelian physics. Chapter six, emergence of the modern worldview, and so on. He's basically arguing. He has 16 chapters. He's basically arguing from the ground up that Aristotelian metaphysics works better with modern like quantum physics, quantum mechanics than other systems do. And he's not a slouch on this. He is really smart. He has his PhD, I want to say from Oxford. I could be wrong, but he's a professor at some university in England, and he teaches physics. And yeah, I mean, he is truly, truly phenomenal. Um, Love his stuff. He's had some interviews with some people. I've been meaning to get him on the show at some point, and he's a really nice guy. I've talked with him back and forth. He has some great ideas. He is brilliant. So I recommend that. I mean, just like $35 for a book of that length is so good. And I couldn't even understand some of the chapters because he's like going into the math of physics and he's identifying certain equations with things that fit within like the Aristotelian framework. And I'm like, I don't even know what's happening here. I'm like, I tried to read them, I just couldn't get them because I'm not really educated in that. But I still gave it 5 stars because everything else is still so good. So yeah, that's what I have.
All right, my last hard copy book. This is Luther's Works, Disputations, Volume 2. I've not read this entire volume. It's pretty thick. This is part of the American edition, so it's CPH for Luther's Works. This is Volume 73. To my knowledge, Disputations 1 is not out yet, or if it did, it just came out recently. But you kind of like count this as its own single work. It's a bunch of different works put together. It's a bunch of Luther's disputations, as well as some disputations that Luther is in that are, say, Bugenhagen's or Melanchthon's or other people's, or Johannes Maccabeus Scotus. He's one of the disputations. But in particular, I've read the Antinomy disputations and some of the disputations on the church. The disputations, in my mind, are not exceptionally interesting because of their actual topic of disputation. So the arguments against antinomianism are good, but I find them much more interesting in looking at their method, the way they defend things, their argumentation style, the arguments that opposing theologians are making. So there are other theologians who are either being devil's advocate or are genuinely in disagreement with Lutherans, who are opposing the theses proposed by the individuals. So, some student may be pursuing a doctoral degree or a master's in something, and they have a dissertation. So they propose a bunch of theses, and then they have to dispute them publicly. And then people recorded those disputes, and that's what becomes the book. So what I find very interesting about these is that you get a lot of Luther using philosophy. Luther is often criticizing philosophy. He is criticizing scholastics and Aristotle and these things. In this volume, he is using a lot of it. So you can see how he views philosophy and theology, how he uses distinctions, how he parses out things like logic and his arguments. So I find that very interesting. It might not seem the most characteristic of Luther. You'll see him utilizing material. He won't be directly citing, say, like Occam or Beale, but then the stuff he's using is very clearly from figures of medieval thought. He might be using things that come from Aquinas and from some secondary source. And he won't cite them directly, but if you look at the footnotes, he's very obviously using content from them, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was with you guys when you first started reading that, actually, or not first started, but like last year, when I was still living near you. I was able to go there, and that stuff was fascinating. Just the method, especially, as you said, like Yeah, the content's good. Like what he says is, yeah, it's good, but especially looking at this and like this is not the Luther we're used to, and so it's interesting to see how he works in different settings, I suppose.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And I don't want to mischaracterize Luther and say he's just like a scholastic or something, because he's not. But
He's
he,
like he was the precursor to Martin Chemnitz, right?
you know, perhaps apart from that, Chemnitz is actually scholastic.
Luther walked so Chemnitz could run.
All right, what's your fourth book?
I'm gonna say Gerhard's On Justification Through Faith. Really good. I think what's especially interesting about, I mean, he goes through the standard proofs of like say sola fide, and he does a lot of stuff that you'll find from earlier Lutheran authors as they're engaging with Rome, like disputing the nature of faith in terms of like, is it or in nature of justification specifically, is it primarily something we look at as transformative, or is the reason justification is effective, or does it avail because it's transformative, or does it avail because it's primarily a declaration on the part of God that's effective, right? He does standard stuff like that, which is really good, but I thought was especially really good about it was his responses to the notion of love as the formal cause of faith. I thought that was really interesting in his discussion of the various degrees of faith. That was really good because I think a lot of people are unaware of it, where the Roman Catholic and Protestant dialogues about faith and justification are often really bad because they're just talking past each other. Where, I mean, you talk to an average Roman Catholic about faith and why it justifies, they're thinking of faith as like a kind of disposition towards affirming something, like just basically a kind of knowledge. Well, not a knowledge as much as like putting something on the level of knowledge, even though you don't have the same ability with like reason or the same assurance as reason. Yeah, at least to yourself, right? It's taking things God says to you and having the disposition to saying, I affirm this like it is knowledge. That doesn't really make sense for them to be justifying because, well, that's just knowledge. I mean, demons have faith. That's James, right? And so Gerhard argues, well, the faith that Ball is talking about is one, not the faith of James. He's talking about faith more so in a trust, in the concept of trust, as Lutherans always said. But also he talks about faith and what, do you need love to form it? And I thought that was really interesting. He makes some interesting arguments about it with, and shows how Bellarmine is inconsistent with respect to the use of something about the will and the intellect and the relation to love and faith. And he says, well, this doesn't really work. So I recommend it, honestly, almost just for that. It was so good. Everything else is phenomenal, but that was something I hadn't encountered yet. And I've read a lot on justification. I would say my primary area of theological study is justification, and Gerhard had some stuff I'd never heard before. So that's definitely there.
That was definitely on my list to pick up of Gerhard. I mean, all of them are, but justification is definitely near the top. All right. My last book. Actually, we have questions. Do you want to answer the questions in chat? Have you read any? I think this is Sungenis. I don't know. From Canaan, he asks.
Yeah. Sungenis. He's talking about Bob's. I think he's talking about Bob Sungenis. Is it Bob Sungenis? He is a Roman Catholic apologist. I have not read from him, but I have friends who, they aren't the biggest. Well, like obviously they're not Roman Catholic, these guys I'm talking to, but they say out of every Roman Catholic apologist, Sungenis is the best to read because he is very charitable. He's very likable, and he actually has some interesting arguments from what I know. But I will say I don't necessarily trust him as a good representative of Roman Catholic theology because or at least modern Roman Catholic theology, because he is very hardcore on geocentrism and also very hardcore on he does not accept classical theism from what I know. So I have not read Bob Sungenis on it. Yeah, it's very unusual.
He doesn't accept classical theism.
It's weird from what I recall. I could be wrong, but I remember reading it.
That would be strange as a Catholic, because Lateran 5 or Lateran 4 and Vatican 1 both bind you to classical theism.
Yeah, it could be that, or it could be something like specifically immutability. It was something weird that I remember. Like he has some articles where he says, like he has a paper called The Immutable God Who Can Change His Mind and The Impassible God Who Can Show Emotion and such. And I think he's making like some arguments that are that are not common, so to speak. Like they are going to be like trying to reconcile a lot of modern stuff with Roman Catholic positions. Again, I'm not an expert. As I said, I literally have not read the guy. This is just hearsay. But from what I'm looking online just to confirm, and I'm seeing a lot of stuff about people saying like, no, you are wrong about this. Like here's an article from another apologist, Dave Armstrong, who says that he has significant theological and scientific errors. So, and this is literally just a compilation of a ton of stuff. Like I'm just going to read some of the links here. Like, I mean, one of them is, does the church support Robertson Genesis novel theories? Talks about his geocentrism and how it's supposed to be dogmatic in his mind or something like that. Oh yeah, he talks about stuff like fake moon landings, bunch of stuff, and yeah.
I mean, interesting stuff, I suppose. I don't know how fake moon landings are relevant to theology directly.
Right. But here's the thing, right? I mean, some of these articles, from what I'm seeing, again, I am not going to be somebody that's read all this stuff, but like a lot of the articles that this guy's saying are confirming what I've said, which are responses to him about God changing his mind and immutability and having emotions and being bound to time, it seems, is a criticism of him. So again, do not take this as something, as me saying, oh, ignore St. Genesis because of this, or even this is a criticism of him. I've literally not read him. I am just saying that this is what I've seen so far, and it just seems interesting. I'd have to engage with it. So from what I can tell, he's not the best representative of Roman Catholic theology, but I would love to read him someday just to see what he says, because his arguments may still be good, as my friends say. So, yeah. Any other questions so far?
No, nothing in particular.
Oh yeah, Zigmo's here says this isn't a question. I love some of these. I just have to read this. So Marcus Williams, a guy I've actually met in person. He was at my church a few months ago. Says a Lutheran reading mostly on Justification. How original, yeah. I know, right? And then Pedro says the worst representatives of Roman Catholicism seem to be anyone with a YouTube channel. I mean, yeah. Besides Brother Peter Diamond, of course.
Peter Diamond, the legend.
He's hilarious. I love that man. And then, yeah. And then Zigmos makes a good point though. A lot of them have different positions. It says that a lot of Roman Catholic apologists have different positions. And I think he's right. I mean, you talk to some Roman Catholic apologists who are like, oh yeah, the faith that Paul was talking about is the faith of James. And then there are others who admit, well, that's not the case. It's talking about initial versus final justification. Then you have others who are a new perspective on Paul types. And so, yeah, I think
a lot of variety.
Yeah.
You also have the whole issue of like taking the position of like Bellarmine on justification and faith versus like Newman, which are very different approaches. And like,
I know. So, and doesn't Christian Wagner take the approach of Newman?
He takes the Newman approach, which makes the debates pretty. It's very different. Like you can't read like Gerhard against Bellarmine is great. Like and he defeats Bellarmine's points, but like then you read Newman and Newman's just making entirely different arguments from entirely different premises. So like it's completely different as far as the framing goes.
Yeah. One final thing. I said Marcus Williams is at my church, so I'm okay with saying where I go. I've mentioned it before. I'm like, people know me. You were, and this is going to connect you too, Seth. So I go to University Lutheran Chapel, Minneapolis. You were on your way to the liturgical conference that was at Zion, Detroit, and you just stopped by. And yeah, so I met you at one point. This was like several months ago. I want to say like September, if not August, something like that. But yeah.
Very good, very good. Oh, well, it's on the way. Maybe I met him too then at the liturgical conference.
Yeah, I am the Zion guy. Well, no, I told him I went to Zion. We're both Zion. Zion was my first Lutheran church. But yeah, so I am the quote Zion guy that he spoke to. But Seth, you're also a Zion guy that you may have met, Marcus. Yeah. So
I was serving in the liturgy at St. Michael's. So you probably saw me carrying the thurible.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. So is it your pick next or mine? I think it's
Uh,
yours. I think it's yours. I
I've
just
done
talked
four
about
books. It's
justification.
mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. My last book, I don't have a hard copy. I read this in digital
Sure.
form. Is the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon or Chalcedon by Richard Price. So this is the Price has produced full translations of the Acts, so the full minutes of every session, as well as the decrees and canons at the ends of the councils. So he's done this for all of the actually, I don't know if it's all the ecumenical councils. He's done a bunch of them. He's done a bunch of the ecumenical councils, as well as some of the smaller ones. He also produces commentary on them, so he gives you introductions, notes. Those are a textual criticism of the councils from different editions, and gives some other commentary about authenticity of works and things like that are cited in the council. So, very interesting work. Honestly, you'd expect a lot of the council to be debating like Christology, and that's not what most of the council is about. I mean, that's what the canons are about often. That's what most of the canons are about. But most of the council is not that. It's people yelling at each other. It's people getting angry at each other about ecclesiological matters, things like who is being genuine in their testimonies, which bishops are acting rightly, are X, Y, and Z monks valid or not? Did this person follow the canons rightly or not? Things like that. And then also debating or talking about the Robert Council of Ephesus 2. So lots of interesting stuff in the price volume. All the price volumes I've been told are excellent. I might get one this year. We'll see. I don't know. They're really expensive, but yeah, if you're interested in like looking at like what a ecumenical council actually looked like in the proceedings, it's I guess I'd say it's not what you'd think, I suppose, from the outside. But it was pretty interesting to read through.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting actually. Um, oh, I have a friend who's asking in another chat. He asked me, "What's that painting on my wall?" That's Transfiguration of Christ in the background. So, anyway, let's see. Yeah, I have one final one. And I should say I tried to read Acts of Council of Council, but I was so busy at that time, I think, of the year where I'm just like I can't like go through it all. So, and I was, yeah, it was very interesting to know. It was like I thought it was like, oh, here's a debate on Christology. It was more just like, yeah, are people acting rightly and all that. My final book, again, a philosophy one, is going to be The Ultimate Reducibility of Essence to Existence in Existential Metaphysics by William E. Carlos. That book was really good. My favorite book of the year. It was really short, actually, or not really short, but it was short compared to the other stuff I've mentioned. So it was basically a discussion of the essence existence distinction in Thomist thought and how it develops and how we need to clarify what that position is. So he covers something I was unaware of, which is the various different understandings of it as to, well, is essence an extrinsic limitation or is existence an sorry, let me reread this. Sorry. Does sense restrict existence from outside, or does essence restrict existence like inside, if that makes sense? And he basically argues that if you hold to the former, that it's extrinsic, then you have like a dual existence theory, wherein like existences or like essences exist before they exist in actuality. So you have to have a different account of existence for possibles. And it was really interesting because apparently that's what Scotus was responding to when he responds to the essence of this distinction, because it's either in Giles of Rome or Henry of Ghent. And he talks about basically Giles of Rome and Henry of Ghent. It was one of them held to that view where essence and existence are two things, are two rays, which you don't want to hold, or and the other guy held they were basically virtually distinct, which is just not the Thomist position. It's always funny. I've mentioned this before. Whenever you read Scotus and he's responding to things that sound like Aquinas, he's probably responding to Giles of Rome or Henry of Ghent. Those guys are just a punching bag for everyone. It's very entertaining. I don't know anyone who genuinely likes those two. It says like, yeah, I follow Henry of Ghent or Giles of Rome. Everyone's like, no, Scotus annihilates them. Yeah, that book was really good though. I gave it like every single page was interesting. It was never dry for me. It was fascinating. That was the best book I've read this year. One of the best I've ever read. So.
All right. We have one more question in chat. Do we ever dabble in fiction? You need fiction this year, Jared?
I mean, I've read some comments from Eastern Orthodox guys. So in that sense, you could say I know a little fiction. In all truth, though, I don't really read too much. In all truth, I don't really read too much fiction. I just don't have way too much time. The way I get my fiction is primarily from like I watch good film, like actual film. So movies. A few nights ago, my girlfriend and I watched Death on the Nile. That was really good. I'm a murder mystery guy. And then yeah, I play some video games. So I try to play some games that have stories. So I'm playing. Sophia and I are playing Halo. We've taken a break. We haven't done it in a while. We've just both been busy, or haven't gotten to it. But yeah, I don't really read too much fiction, just to be honest. Like I tried, but I have so few hours in my day. I try to learn stuff, and fiction for me is just not my thing. But I respect people that read it. I have nothing against it. So.
I do dabble in fiction. If you're talking straight literature, this year I've been reading Space Trilogy. I considered putting Space Trilogy in this video, but I left it out. I've read the first 2 books of the Space Trilogy by Lewis, so Isle of the Silent Planet and Paralandra, and I just started That Hideous Strength. Very, very good books. I liked the first one better than the second. Paralandra was a little bit more like Paralandra is like a meandering story. It kind of like it goes somewhere. You kind of think it's going to go somewhere, and it slowly turns in a different direction. The second book was still great too, but overall, great series. Space Trilogy, I would highly recommend. Mm-hmm. It deals with philosophical issues, especially of modernism, and as Lewis does. Lewis in general handles a lot of things with modernism in his philosophical works. So right. I highly recommend the Space Trilogy. It's great fiction. It's not too hard of reading if you're used to hard reading. If you're used to like Tolkien, this will be easy. I guess if you're used to like Narnia, this would be hard. But Narnia is written for like children. Yeah, not that they aren't great, but they're written for children.
I would actually say that anybody who reads enough theology and philosophy should read Dante. His Divine Comedy is like insanely good. That's like my favorite piece of fiction. Or at least that I've read, because obviously it's very theological and philosophical, and I love Dante's interpretation of hell, purgatory, and heaven. Of course, we're Lutherans, so we don't affirm purgatory, but he still has some interesting stuff in there. And especially Paradiso is my favorite. Inferno is the easiest. Purgatory is a little harder. Paradiso, it's like impossible to read unless you have like a commentary and you understand the ancient stuff. Like it's like a full canto on the rotation of the Earth's axis according to Aristotelian physics. Just like what is going on here? And then he does some impressions almost of guys. So like he has an impression of Aquinas that is really good. So that was entertaining for me. I read that like about 4.5 years ago. I read that. I loved that work, and I gave my books off to a girl from Michigan because she was really interested in that stuff. I'm like, I finished reading these, so I don't really need them anymore. I prefer to keep my nonfiction. So yeah, I really like that. Do we have any other questions here? Oh, Dante Trilogy is goated. Yeah, even if it's just Greek mythology. I mean, it's so good. Yeah.
I mean, Greek mythology. You gotta read the Odyssey and Iliad. I mean, if we're talking like ancient fiction too, I mean, like classic text.
Yeah, Odyssey's really good. I haven't read Iliad.
You gotta read Plato's Cratylus. You get the myth of Atlantis. It's very interesting.
What do you mean myth?
Sorry, dude. Atlantis, not the myth. It's not fiction. Atlantis is real.
Atlantis is pre-diluvian.
It's not like antediluvian Hyperborea. Atlantis.
One of my favorite pictures of all time. Do you know the there's this image that atheists put out about like how scientific progress was going up like this, then it like drops down for the Dark Ages and like increases as Christianity falls. And some guy made like took that and like expanded it to talk about like from a
Oh yeah,
biblical view.
the
It's
old
like
space words. Oh,
yes,
I've seen
I
the one
got
with the
I
old
have to
space
find the
wars and
image.
the monoliths. That
Um,
was a classic, like way back, like I mean, not early internet, but like early 2000s, late 2000s internet.
oh,
There was
I
that
found it.
image
I found it.
circulated so many times. It was everywhere.
It's like my favorite thing. Is there a way to share screen on this or no?
I think
I
there
don't
is.
know.
Yeah, I think it's
Oh yeah,
present.
there is. There is.
Yeah, I think it's present.
Let me pull this thing up. Let me
It's a classic.
share screen. Yeah. Don't share these again. Yeah. I'm gonna do.
Someone also asks if
I
Narnia
think
has a
it's.
problem with pluralism.
I don't
Yeah,
know. I haven't.
that's been debated. I was just talking about friends with this. Let me see if I can find the discussion.
I'm gonna open
I
that.
mean, just talking about it as in I was like a few months ago or something.
Just look at this. I just love the Finnish and Korean empires, the hyperwar rise of Pi people, PIE peoples, whole left by the Finno-Korean hyperwar.
Oh yeah, the
I don't
Finno-Korean
even know
Hyper
what.
War.
Yeah, I know this Phaeton Centurion expansion, destruction of Maldek. I love Mu, Age of Atlantis, A base, pre-Diluvian Babylon, and then historically attested worldwide flood. Yep, and then just all this stuff, and like it's clearly just to respond to this guy who's like, yeah, everything was the fall, Dark Ages. But yeah,
Oh, Jared left by accident instead of stop presenting. It's a funny meme, anyhow. As for the pluralism question, so Lewis specifically states otherwise in his letters about the pluralism question. He's answering a question that was popular in his time, and I mean, it's a question that's been raised a lot of times, but it was specifically being addressed in his own time, and it was addressed by like Vatican II, for example, which is the question of like invincible ignorance. And so Lewis is saying, let's say you have the remote tribe in Africa that has never heard of Jesus. If they worshipped this, like what Paul calls like the unknown God, if they worship that, then Lewis thinks they could be saved pretty much. And the reason, one of the reasons for this is that Lewis takes a much more like Catholic stance on the effects, or honestly, not even a Catholic stance necessarily. He takes probably more of an Eastern stance on like how original sin and depravity works. This comes through a little bit in his Mere Christianity. If you read that, he actually specifically says he denies total depravity in there. So he doesn't take the like traditional Protestant position. So if you have that like in the back of your mind, and then you look at his context of he's answering this question of like invincible ignorance, he's saying that you can be saved from invincible ignorance if you specifically only focus on the true parts of your like tribal religion. So this would be like focusing on the fact that there's a God and that he's all good and things like that. And then also not focusing on the false parts. So is there some pluralism? I mean, sure, you can make an argument that he's like, there's some pluralism in there, but it's not like he's just like taking a real, like what we'd usually call a pluralist position. He's actually taking a pretty close position to like what Roman Catholics would say. So he's not usual at all, especially for his time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't read too much Lewis. I mean, I've read his nonfiction stuff, right? I really enjoyed. I thought he handles miracles pretty well. The fiction I really liked from his was, of course, Screw Tape Letters. I really enjoyed that. That's really fun. Although I do have to say, I remember one time I was talking to this guy. He's like, he was reading Screw Tape Letters from the book. He's like, man, it's just so hard to read because you got to remember like the perspectives and just like.
I mean, I guess it's harder than Narnia once again.
Yeah, I'm just, but like this guy's like way older than I am. I was like, I mean, that was when I was like 18. I heard that too. I'm like, this is really hard. You know, I feel bad saying that, but still.
If you want more good fiction, I did pull out my Tolkien. Tales from the Perilous Realm. This is some stuff that's Middle Earth, some stuff that's not. So you do get like stuff from like about the Tom Bombadil in here that's like Middle Earth focused, and other things that are completely unrelated. It's just like other Tolkien literature. Very good. A lot of it's poetic. And then The Great Tales, which is a 3-volume set. Big thick boy. It's a little expensive. I don't know what the price tag is on these days. I think it might have been like $70 when I got it for 3 volumes, which actually isn't that bad. Like when you're looking at, you get like the full nice case. Those are sleeve covers. The books
That's
themselves
nice.
are nice hardcover. If I open up and take off a sleeve cover, I can show you. These are the main texts from the first age. And this is these are much more in-depth treatments than you'll get in the Silmarillion on these topics, because the Silmarillion covers some of these. So these are fully fleshed out, edited versions by Christopher Tolkien of a lot of those first age stories. I have not finished them, but very good. They are a little slow paced, as all of Tolkien is in fiction. So I mean, if you like things like Lord of the Rings, this is great. It is easier than Silmarillion. Silmarillion can be is a really hard to wrap your head around sometimes, just because you're trying to remember so many relations of this guy is the son of that guy and that guy's the son of that guy. And if you're not good at keeping your genealogies intact in your head, then Silmarillion can be a little difficult. These are not as bad. These are much more straightforward narrative, much closer to something like you'd see in Lord of the Rings. Very good volumes, would recommend.
One thing I wanted to say though is regarding fiction. So I'm gonna make a video on this soon. Something I like. For those of you here listening, I guess get a brief little discussion of this. I mean, Seth, you and I could talk about it, I suppose, a little bit. I think it'd be interesting. Is one thing I want to talk about is kind of one of the appeals of the charismatic movement, where, honestly, it makes a lot of Christianity more interesting insofar as there's a lot more discussion of supernatural stuff. I know it sounds funny at first, but it is true where a lot of people just they're like, oh, I affirm the virgin birth, I affirm the resurrection, they affirm the necessities and all this stuff, and they're like, well, okay, well, let's talk about what's Paul talking about when he talks about principalities and powers and this stuff about Michael reigning over, oh, not reigning, but protecting Israel in Daniel 10. And everyone's like, no, this is a figurative or something. They just kind of ignore that. But the reason I say that is because one of the reasons I'm not reading as much fiction is because one thing I'm spending a lot of time on is trying to understand more of the supernatural world. So I'm listening to a solid amount of those kinds of podcasts of people discussing ancient Near East stuff, which is Seth's specialty, actually, I'd say. So
yeah, if you want ancient Near East stuff, I'm talking about fiction. I mean, a lot of Second Temple literature kind of reads like fiction. Some of it probably is fiction. Some of it probably isn't. It's hard to say exactly where the line is drawn on a lot of stuff. But if you're looking for that, the Charlesworth Old Testament pseudepigrapha, I mentioned at the beginning of the stream reading Jubilees and the Martyrdom and Ascension of Isaiah. This is volume 2. There's also volume 1, of course. There's 2 total. Really thick. I mean, this thing is huge. I can tell you the page count. It's 1,006 pages. Big guy. They also come in hardcover. They're more expensive hardcover, so I have softcover. These are, I mean, if you're looking for something that's kind of theology but scratches the fiction itch, this is what you want, honestly. Very interesting stuff. There's expansion of Old Testament stories. There's stuff that's Old Testament era, but is completely different material, like the story of the Egyptian magicians, Janus and Jambres. You'll get stuff like that in here. Or like I said, the story of the martyrdom and ascension of Isaiah. I mean, that's not in the Bible anywhere, but those are the types of things it's telling you. And that does get referenced. That actually gets referenced in Hebrews. The martyrdom of Isaiah, the one who was sawed in half, that's referenced in Hebrews. That's Isaiah. It's in the martyrdom of Isaiah, the Texas.
Well, so that's part of why I'm trying to understand ancient Near East stuff like Enoch, because of course Jude references it, right? And so it's just
references a bunch, and Enoch has a few references actually in the New Testament. Arguably, Jude's the obvious one, but there are a number of times where it seems like a pretty clear allusion to it.
Yeah, but it's that's why I'm trying to understand that whole world and get an understanding of, just so I can really picture those things, I suppose. Because I think it's always been a fascination of mine, even when I was especially when I was young. I was really interested in the pre-diluvian world of you just have a bunch of stuff on the begetting, you know what I mean? Enoch leaves, and just what, and then it just says, pretty much he walked with God, and then Noah, and of course Genesis 6, the Nephilim and all that stuff. It was always so interesting to me. It's why does no one talk about this that I can find? Is there any material on it? And actually finding stuff of oh, hey, look, here are some people that are theorizing some pretty wild things that are actually interesting. The most insane one I found insane in a good way. It was really interesting. Was I want to preface all of this by saying none of this is essential to being Lutheran. Like none of this. No, you don't have to believe any of this. This is just me being wild. Like it's just interesting. As a guy who basically argues, as I said earlier in the stream, a guy who argues there's a lot of connections between Enoch, or the contents of Enoch and the concept of Atlantis, of like the gods ruling over, and he's saying like, yeah, that's kind of what was going on back then with these Nephilim and like mating with women and all this stuff and like ruling over these areas. Again, it's pretty wild stuff, but it's interesting. Before I
Yeah,
forget,
if people want oh, you can go ahead first.
I was just gonna say before I forget, there was one guy who asked, he says, would you guys ever be interested in doing a reading group? Seth, that's an excuse for you to make a Patreon. You need to make the Patreon to make
Yeah,
bank account. I am sure. I'd love to do a reading group.
Patreon for forever.
Yeah.
I need to essentially what he's happening. I need to go open a bank account and start a company for the group pretty much. Once I have that done, I can open up Patreon, and then we can start things like reading group, and yeah, we would probably limit it to patrons. I don't imagine we'd make it that high of a patron like setting, like maybe like $5-10 a month or something.
$6,000.
$6,000. Yes.
Yeah.
But we do want to start something like that soon, just because we put a good amount of time into these, Jared especially, and the it'd be nice to have something at least to like get out of it, or even just like buying like high quality mics or cameras.
Well, I have a new camera and I like this thing, but
yeah, yours
is pretty good.
Or like buying a new book. Yes, this is my MacBook camera. It's decent for just like built in.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I really want, so Serene could use some stuff. So one of our contributors, she's made a few videos. She has one coming up. I've scheduled it. I'm gonna actually push it back to next week. It was supposed to be this week's video, but we're doing this, push it back to next week because I'm busy and all that. But one of our friends, Serene, is in another country, and she could use probably some equipment. So it'd be wonderful to use some of those funds for her sake. Just stuff like that, But yeah, I mean, honestly, it'd be interesting to do a reading group. The only thing I'd probably want something a little more advanced, like doing like I'd be up for whatever. Honestly, we'd figure it out, but I'd be interested in that. So we'll see what happens. And yeah, I'll say I am going to, after we put this video out, there was one guy who asked to link Zigma's channel because you can't click on it. Zigma's, can you DM me? I have you on some group messaging app. Can you message me the link to the video that you had about Kierkegaard? I can't remember, and I can put it up, I suppose, because I think that'd be interesting for people to watch. Just message me. I think you're on Telegram. I can't remember.
The other thing that would be just kind of relevant is on the topic of like Second Temple literature and that type of thing in ancient Near East. I know Cooper's criticized Heiser a lot, but Heiser does put a lot of good content. You don't have to accept everything Heiser says.
No,
I think we disagree with his method frequently, and he's a Baptist, and so I don't think his New Testament's often. His New Testament, I'd say, is quite a mixed bag, but I find his Old Testament content to be really, really good.
Yep.
As far as like reading the Bible in ancient Near Eastern context and looking at Second Temple literature, don't have to agree with him on everything, but like the big thing for Heiser, in my opinion, is that you get a lot of like interesting data and stuff that you don't get elsewhere because he's interacting with a lot of academic lit. So you can parse out the information how you want, but he's just going to give it to you. So I mean, you're gonna get some bias because Heiser pretty much tells you like off the bat, like he's just gonna tell you about things he finds interesting in the text. So it's not like a specific study of any particular thing in text, but it's really good stuff. So
yeah, that's my experience with Heiser. Is I've not read and listened to him nearly as much as you have, but I've listened to my fair amount. Is like there's some stuff you'll disagree with methodologically. Like you and I obviously are going to put much more stake in the fathers and the creeds than he is. But I do think a lot of what he says is very interesting. And I think from what you've told me, Seth, one of the difficulties with Cooper's criticism is that he basically wants to return to some previous Lutheran thinkers for the Old Testament theology, which is like fine for the most part. But the thing is, they're just not working with the same data that Heiser has. Like they don't have the same amount of stuff. And so you can't just go back to them and be like, oh yeah, just ignore this stuff that Heiser brings out. And so I think part of the reason I'm trying to listen to all that stuff and read a bunch is so I can actually get a systematic approach to it, because there's a lot of stuff you can listen to or watch where they're going to put out a bunch of stuff on like supernatural stuff, but it's like they don't have a system beyond, oh, we're Christian and this is stuff that seems to be happening. I really want to understand, okay, well, what is a system through which we can understand this, right? And I think having the Enoch stuff is helpful, but I'm trying to think like, okay, how do we get this within Lutheranism? That's like a big side project of mine. I don't know if I'd ever make a video on it. I'm not qualified for that, at least as of now. Probably not for the next few years, at least. But it's still so interesting, and Heiser's been helpful in my mind.
Yeah, the guys over at Lord of Spirits, they're Eastern Orthodox, but they have a similar kind of project to Heiser. It's not quite the same thing, but they do similar type of content. Once again, with a take the stuff they say with a grain of salt. I find they're not as good at citing their material. Heiser's going to tell you like the book he's citing. He's like, this is from this person's commentary on this book, and you can grab it from there, and he'll give direct quotes. The Lord of the Spirits guys are not nearly as good at citing their sources, so I'm a little more wavery on accepting just things they say. But in general, they produce content in the same like sphere. But they are, since they're Eastern Orthodox, they do bring patristic material into the podcast as well. But instead of a Baptist bias, you get an Orthodox bias. So I mean, do with that what you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something of value, though, right? Like to read a bunch of to see how different people from different systems understand this is pretty valuable. Because you want to see like, okay, well, is Heiser's like Baptist views, like how does that affect it at all versus these Eastern Orthodox guys? And that's, I don't know, it's just interesting to me. And some of the guys I listen to are more out, like they're like dispensationalists, or like a lot of like their New Testament stuff. They have a bunch of like predictions about stuff. I'm like, yeah, just ignore this basically. Like their Old Testament stuff is actually like really good. So that's just how I am. So yeah, I don't really have anything else on that topic.
No, that's all I got too. Anything else on books for the year?
I mean, there's just a bunch of stuff. Like I condensed, as I said, this is like a top 5 for me. One thing I do actually want to mention is a book I hated. Can I do that?
Sure, go ahead.
There was a book I read.
Most hated book of the year.
Yeah. There was a book I read called. Well, there were 2 that I read. One of them I'm going to cover in a stream soon. It was Ken Wilson's popular level work, the foundation of Augustinian Calvinism. It was just complete trash. No, it was horrible. But that's not the book I want to mention, because I am going to have a stream on that with some others where we're going to cover that. That's going to be fun. I read it just to see if he's correct. The reason I didn't like it because I think he misrepresents a bunch of stuff. The book I really just hated, though. There was a book called Worship in the Name of Jesus by Peter Brunner. And a lot of guys I know are like, oh, this is a classic. This is phenomenal. I read it. It's literally just a bunch of existentialist ramblings using a bunch of Greek and Latin terms and just saying this is what worship is. And like he doesn't support any of it. Like I can't remember how many Bible verses he references. It's just a bunch of nonsense. And half of it is just like, what is he even saying? It's like I could condense half of his stuff, like so many of his things, into a few sentences. There was one thing I got out of it, which like everybody already says, which is worship is eschatological. Like, yeah, that's great. But the book is like 300 pages, and each sentence is things like I'm literally making this up. Is something like the pneumatic presence within the worship experience or within the ecclesia is sanctifying to those in participation, recognizing the holiness of the pneumatic understanding. Just like nonsense. Just like, what are you even saying, dude? Just like write this down clearly. Stop trying to be profound. I hated that book with a passion. It was brutal.
All right, if we're going with least favorite book this year, I'd say Plato's Laws. And I pasted in chat a link to my blog post.
Yep.
So I read the entire Socratic corpus in 7 months is the title. And my conclusion was don't do it. The conclusion was read the Bible instead. There's interesting stuff in Plato. There's interesting stuff in Xenophon. There's even interesting stuff in Aristophanes. But man, did the Laws bore me. The Laws is Plato's longest work. It's also his last work. Well, that or Epinomis, depending on if you accept Epinomis as legitimate. Epinomis literally means just after the Laws. So it's the epilogue to the Laws. but it's largely considered apocryphal. But the laws is just it's just a lot of laws that Plato proposes if he were the leader of his country. So if he is leading Athens, he says that if you accidentally hurt someone with your cart, then you need to pay 300 denarii or whatever to the government and 200 to him or something. Like this is what the book is. It's that for like hours and hours and hours and hours of reading. It's ridiculously long, and it's just a bunch of specific laws for specific cases. There's philosophy in there. It is in there, but it's like parsing it out and getting it is just it's difficult, and it's extremely boring overall, honestly. If you want like the philosophy, honestly, just like watch like videos on like there's not a lot of videos on Plato's laws. There's a series by what's the channel called now? All About Platonism, which she's a little bit an unusual figure, but nonetheless, if you want kind of like the more like philosophical, spiritualized version of Plato's laws, just go watch those videos instead, and don't read Plato's laws. It was just extremely tedious and dull to get through, but I had to read the whole thing, so I did.
Sounds about right. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say, so
There do I.
Yeah.
All right, well, we don't have any more questions, so thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year, everyone.